One of the unfortunate side effects of the terrible shooting just a week or two ago in Buffalo is that many people who might not have been talking or thinking much about great replacement theory have been forced to. It was up until the Uvalde shooting a big topic of conversation around the country, but it is not new in the American context or internationally. So we wanted to make sure that people knew a little bit about this, about some of the connections between this theory and different political ideologies, some of the other outgrowths from it. And so we were very lucky to be welcomed once again on the program by professor at Yale, as well as the author of How Fascism Works. Jason Stanley, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, John.
Glad to have you here, although as we said, beforehand, never to talk about anything light and sunny, but in any event, generally when you come on the program, it has been to talk about fascism. Here we're talking specifically about this replacement theory, but in your writings, you talk about some of the connections between these two things.
Right, so fascism survives on a politics of fear. And what is the fear of? The fear is very often characteristically, in the case of the classic fascist movements of mid-century Europe and Germany, Nazi Germany, of replacement of the people, the ethnic population by others, usually by non-whites. So Mussolini in 1934 gave a speech on is the white race in danger? Hitler, this was a repeated theme, the idea that both that Jews were bringing in immigrants to replace the Germans as a kind of tactic, and that Jews themselves were intermingling with good Aryan women to produce, to ruin the Germans. And our own fascist movement, the Ku Klux Klan, which is generally called the first functionally fascist organization, say by Robert Paxton, that replacement was very central to their ideology. The idea of the second Klan, for instance, was that Jews were urging black people to overthrow the white race, and were also bringing in immigrants to undermine white Christianity, so that ultimately Jews could take over. That's why in Charlottesville they chanted, "Jews will not replace us." They didn't mean literally that Jews were going to be the replacers. They meant rather that Jews were behind the replacement of the white race. And what we've seen across the world since Anders Breivik's massacre of over 70 people in Norway, and through to the Christchurch killings in New Zealand, is manifesto after manifesto appeal to great replacement theory and the danger of replacing the white population to justify mass murder.
Definitely, and there's a couple different ways this manifests that I'm sure we're going to talk about. But just to be clear for people who might be new to this, this is now something that variations of it you can see in different countries, and certainly in the US, like this is now a standard thing that's just talked about on Fox News pretty much every day. But to be clear, even just a few years ago, talking about replacing the white population with more docile voters, that would have been relegated to Stormfront or some extremist forum just a few years ago, right?
Just a few years ago. It is shocking. And sort of unparalleled, the normalization of this rhetoric in a mainstream political party like the Republicans. We scholars of rhetoric and propaganda don't know what to make of it. What do you do when you have a conspiracy theory that has justified in the last decade numerous mass slaughters? Dylan Roof in Charleston, as I said, Breivik. Tarrant killed 51 people in a mosque in New Zealand using this justification. And historically was at the center of some of the worst movements in the right-wing authoritarian movements. The justification for their terrible internal violence. What happens when it becomes normalized by a mainstream political party? I don't know, but it's not good.
And I believe there's a lot of mass shootings. It's tough to remember all the details of them because they happen so frequently in the US. But I believe the Tree of Life manifesto implied that they believed that Jewish people were bringing in caravans of migrants. And I believe in El Paso, wasn't that Walmart shooting that seemed to have had linkages to this as well?
Yeah, implied is too gentle of a term for the fact that the actual justification of the Tree of Life mass murder of my fellow Jewish people was done by direct appeal to Great Replacement Theory, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. So the killer went into the Tree of Life synagogue and murdered so many Jewish people on the grounds that he believed the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was bringing in immigrants, was behind immigrants. When you hear Tucker Carlson or others talk about globalists bringing in immigrants, that is a dog whistle to anti-Semites. People who aren't anti-Semites won't hear that, but every anti-Semite will hear Jewish people are bringing in immigrants, because that is the historical center of 20th century anti-Semitism in the West.
Yeah. Now, I know you said people have been trying to figure out what is it that changed and changed so quickly that this is now not just beginning to seep into like some sort of like radical right-wing YouTube channel, but it jumped immediately. Tucker Carlson has the largest audience on cable news, and it is his go-to almost every night you hear it. Is this a consequence of Trump? Are they both consequences of something? Can we chalk this up to, well, once QAnon has become normalized, literally no conspiracy theory can be so crazy that you can't talk about it openly? What is your best guess at this point?
Well, let's be clear. The United States has long had a virulent history of virulent racism and anti-immigrant paranoia. In Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, he praises the United States as a model. He says the United States, with its immigration laws, like the Asian Exclusion Act, that banned non-white immigrants from coming to the United States and forbade Asians from getting US citizenship. These are things that affected European fascism. So they're native to the United States. They're native to a time when we had racial fascism, our own native racial fascism. We had Jim Crow laws. We had a clear, explicit demand to keep America majority white. And so this is our home turf. And we thought the civil rights movement and similar movements to address this past would have put it in the past. But it's not in the past. And when we look at this past, it's a past that affects European fascism. It's a past that was deeply anti-democratic. Elections were decided by but with a radical voter suppression of black populations. So I think it's a signal that we're returning to this past, and we're also, but the level of mainstreaming and normalizing, I think that the mass media brings. I mean, it was always, even when we talk about Father Coughlin, when we talk about past figures who were fascist, the level of normalization among one political party, it's and in 2022 is very worrisome, and the way it justifies. So we've seen it justify. I think here's the key point: we've seen white replacement theory time and time again justify individual acts of mass violence. What happens when a political party embraces it as its core message and then takes power? Well, that history suggests will justify mass state violence against population.
Can I definitely want to turn to, trying to figure out what it is that can be done as a response to it, but just really fast, because before the interview, we were talking a bit about some of the shift that we seem to have seen by domestic Republicans from focusing on critical race theory to more of this gender theory, and a gigantic focus on the trans community, but the LGBTQ community as well. Is this sort of just a new form of replacement that in the past they'd replace you with migrants, but now they're replacing you with your kids with a trans version of your kids, or that they're stripping away something not racially about you, but something core in terms of your masculinity? Is that designed to appeal to the same fears in conservatives?
So what they want to do, it's a different conspiracy theory, but it's designed to appeal to similar fears. They want to appeal to threats to your children. They want to see, they say they're threatening your children. And liberalism allows this. And what you need is you need a macho authoritarian response that will protect your children. Where are the men, they say, which is a direct appeal to patriarchy. It's saying a real man wouldn't allow, this kind of, your children to be exposed to the idea that gender is fluid or that same-sex marriage is normal. And so they're trying to make you fear that people will get at your children. And so you need an authoritarian, powerful response to deal with them. So this is why you find you find both historically authoritarian movements on the far right, like Nazism, both appealing to hysteria about LGBT and racial hysteria. Because it's a politics of fear, right? So the idea is you need a strong male leader to protect you, or a strong authoritarian party. And it is the classic tactic that we're seeing from far right authoritarian movements and governments across the world, starting really with Russia's adoption of its gay propaganda law in 2013.
Exactly. Yeah. And now we see that being such a big focus at the federal and state level amongst right wingers here. So, okay, so we've seen this happen in other countries, some form of this. We're seeing it rapidly escalate in the US. I don't anticipate that you necessarily have all of the specific examples of how we fight back against this, but at this point, based on your knowledge of the US as well as other countries, do you have any advice to either politicians or the media? What can we do to provide, like it's not a falsifiable theory, the idea that politicians are literally importing people to replace them. It is madness that we're going up against. So how do you fight back against something like that?
That is a great question. I say stalling for an answer. How do you fight back against these classical conspiracy theories that have created a politics of fear? Well, one way is you explain what's going on. You say, look, they're trying to make you afraid. This is a politics of power to split the working class so that you don't unify against essentially billionaires who are behind this. What they really want is they want to keep the gas and oil flowing. They want to keep the taxes low. And they're splitting. The politics of fear is always done for that reason, right? It's always done to split the working class apart. So you remind people, like, where's your health care? What's really at stake here for you? You have retiring parents, you have healthcare costs. This is what's really at stake. And what this group is really after in the United States is destroying public schools and destroying public infrastructure. So a thoroughgoing of defense of the importance of public schools, of public goods in a democracy, is, I think, will help here in fighting against the politics of fear.
I'm curious, just a fast response from you on this. It seems to me that when there are obviously so many objective issues that are facing the American people, and you have the right who has no interest in actually fighting back against them, that's one of the reasons they're deluding people with these conspiracy theories. It seems like what the other side could do is actually address these crises, address people's falling wages, address the fact that health insurance is so expensive that home prices are rising so fast. Like, I feel like a direct counterattack to the conspiracy theory is inherently difficult, but I feel like you can make the ground much less fertile for these sorts of conspiracy theories to take root by making people a little bit less terrified of the future.
That's been the theory. That's the dominant theory. It's sort of what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in the 1930s to fight fascism. He pushed the New Deal through. Of course, thanks to Joe Manchin and Senator Sinema, we're not going to get those responses, those sorts of massive programs to deal with people's fear. And of course, what the Republicans are going to do if they give in to this fascist social and political movement in their midst is they won't do anything to fight the very real social and economic fears, because that's what feeds the fear. The politics won't work again. They'll intend to make crime worse, because if there's greater social division, greater protest, greater hunger, there'll be greater crime and hence greater fear to run on again. So they try to make the problems worse so they can use the politics of fear to win again and again and again.
Well, big issue. We've got a few directions potentially to move in socially. Hopefully we'll figure out more as time goes on. But as always, even if we can't necessarily solve it, it is important to understand the problem we're facing. So we do appreciate you joining us. I know you had mentioned before we began this interview that you had an upcoming book. Have you released any information about that yet?
It's an academic book about, I do talk about some of it's called The Politics of Language with Princeton University Press. It really looks at some of the propaganda wars like the critical race theory propaganda war, the gender ideology propaganda war, and goes under the hood to see how they exploit people's unconscious biases to direct negative attention to targets. So that's what they're trying to destroy, the public schools. So they say the public schools are teaching your kids gender ideology and critical race theory. So then people think negatively about that target, and that's what's going on. And that's what my book really unpacks on the detailed level.
Okay, I'm gonna have to definitely take a look at that. But for now, thank you again for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much, John.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.